Good evening from Rocky Mountain PBS. I'm Cynthia Hessen. Thanks for joining us for Colorado State of Mind. And on our minds tonight, some unexpected twists and turns on the climate change front, just as the World Talks in Copenhagen start on Monday. Our guests are all people who take an active interest in this topic, and here they are, first from Denver.
My name is John Golden Dubois, and I'm a principal with Confluence Strategies. We work with environmental organizations and other nonprofits to help them plan and build effective campaigns.
And from Grand Junction.
I'm Betsy Marston. I edit an op-ed syndicate called Writers on the Range, and it's for High Country News based in Paonia.
Also from Douglas County.
I'm Lee Bowie. I'm with Tri-State Generation and Transmission Association. We're the not-for-profit wholesale power provider to 44 rural electric cooperatives and public power districts in the West.
And also from Denver and Aspen.
I'm Sally Ranney, and I am the CEO of a wetlands mitigation banking company called Stillwater Preservation LLC, and I also am the co-director of American Renewable Energy Day and Policy Summit that we hold in Aspen at the Aspen Institute every August.
It is very good to have all of you here as we take a look at where things stand, the politics, the science, and the perceptions on the topic of global warming. It's an issue which has been with us for several years now, with very slow progress toward a consensus in the world about the severity of the situation and what should be done about it. Copenhagen is thought to be key to the effort to get old and new economies on the same page and committed to reducing carbon emissions. But some new developments in recent weeks have set an unusual scene for the Denmark event. There was the leak of a batch of emails from a research facility in Britain, which seemed to cast suspicion about whether dissenting views of climate change science have been suppressed. And polling organizations, both here in the U.S. and in other countries, are indicating the public concern about global warming may be softening due to a number of factors. We're going to talk about those things as we go on in this half hour, but let's start with what we think President Barack Obama is going in with when he attends the climate meeting next week. What do you expect that he's going to commit this country to? How is it going to be monitored here or elsewhere?
I think the primary thing that he's going to commit to is a reduction in greenhouse gases over time for the United States. I think on the level of 17% by 2020, a 17% reduction by 2020, and up to an 83% reduction by 2050. And those mirror closely bills that have been passed already in Congress.
But he can't really promise anything, can he? I mean, doesn't he go with provisional promises?
Right. I would agree with that. And right now, Senator John Kerry and Joe Lieberman and Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, they are now pooling their concerns and their interests to draft not a bill from the bill that came out of the Environmental and Policy Works Committee, not that bill, Boxer Kerry bill. This is one that they are going to try to integrate their interests, but it won't be legislation that comes out of this conversation. What's going to come out of it, hopefully, are principles that President Obama can take to Copenhagen.
And maintaining the competitiveness of the American economy is going to be critical in this process, and it's going to be interesting to watch the positioning of both the developing and the industrialized countries as Copenhagen proceeds. But those principles are very key to what happens here at home in Washington, where we need to ensure that electric rates, energy costs are kept affordable. It's critical to the economic recovery. It's critical to the continuation and growth of jobs and investment here in the West.
That's the crux of it, of course, of whether the United States and other developed countries are going to move before the developing countries who are arguably set to use a lot more of the world's energy.
Well, you're right. I think that's been one of the challenges and one of the things that stopped Kyoto Protocol from being adopted here in the United States is that there were many within Congress who said that until the developing world makes some commitments to reductions, the United States didn't want to do that. Well, in the past couple of weeks, as you mentioned, there's been a lot of developments on all these issues. So as the President has come forth and said, okay, we're ready in the United States to make some commitments here, so have both China and India, in particular in terms of reducing their growth in carbon emissions over the next 20 years. So that's a really important step, because obviously if you take the United States and you take China and you take India, you're talking about, you know, a tremendous proportion of the overall carbon emissions. And so getting commitments from those developing countries, I think, also pushes the conversation forward here in Congress to take some concrete action. I think, Betsy, you're absolutely right. The President's word is only as good as what we can actually commit to in a real sense here, and I think that's going to be the follow-up to Copenhagen, is how do we actually begin to meet those commitments.
And boy, it has turned partisan. Betsy, I know you want to talk about this situation with the emails. Bring us up to speed on what you think happened there.
Well, who knows who the hackers are, but I think what they reveal is somewhat troubling. This East Anglia University is part of the Nobel-winning prize effort to get the word out about global warming. And it did seem as though the scientists involved were very protective of their information, very solicitous about having the message get out just the way they wanted. But overall, I don't think any large bombs were dropped by the revelation that came out of the emails. And it said to me that scientists are snarky, they're very human, they're defensive, they're incredibly protective of what they're doing because they're zealots. They're true zealots for the cause of doing something about global warming. And I thought one of the funniest things that came out was that they were passing around some sort of picture of the climate change skeptics out on an ice floe. So, you know, you could just imagine these people feeling beset and besieged by all the people who somehow don't get it. I mean, there is this terrible split, certainly in this country, between people who trust what scientists tell them and others who really don't believe it.
And for years, I just want to add, for years, as you probably know, Betsy, having been in the environmental movement for 30-some years, is when Stephen Schneider, who's a climate scientist who's now with Stanford, he was the first one to reveal the possibility of climate change and GHGs, greenhouse gases. And when he stepped out of the academic and the scientific community to make that statement, all the other scientists stepped back. It was very, very difficult to get a critical mass, even though people had been studying this for a very long time. And so that has shifted. Now scientists are seeing that things are moving much faster than the original climate models predicted. And so now you have scientists stepping into the fore and really, you know, coming out in defense not only of their science but also in defense of action and implementation at the policy level and the regulatory level.
There's no question that some credibility is at stake here, and very tough questions are being asked. In the near term, I think it's going to have an effect on what does happen in the Senate next year, both in the pace and the intensity of the pursuit of climate legislation. So it remains to be seen just how far and widespread this issue is and what effects it could have next year.
Do you think?
I hope you're not right. No, I really do, because I don't think, from my reading, and of course we're all reading about something, we don't have any first-hand knowledge of this, nothing big really came out of that, except there are a bunch of human beings who want to protect themselves a little too much. They need to be more transparent. That's clear. But I don't think it made a dent in what we now know is the danger of climate change.
When you say nothing big came out of that, you're saying it's not clear that opposite science or opposite scientific thinking was suppressed? Is that what you're saying?
I don't think it was. I think it was manipulated to some extent. I wouldn't deny that. They do seem to want to make sure that it's a message that doesn't have too many cracks in it. So they need more transparency. That's clear. But in terms of what's really going on scientifically, I don't think there was a dent in that.
I think that's right. I mean, remember that we're talking about peer-reviewed studies that have
Right.
been seen by hundreds and hundreds of scientists who have gone back over the data. So I think it's going to be and will remain an interesting side story, but I think
Exactly,
ultimately it's
yeah.
not going to make that much of a difference. I think the one thing that is really important to remember is that folks on the other side of the debate who have denied global warming have really relied on manipulation of data for the past 20 years. And in fact, not only has it been a secret manipulation of data, it's been a very public manipulation of data, and they've spent millions and millions of dollars to get their message out that global warming is not happening. If global warming is happening, it's not caused by humans. You know, so to really try and cause doubt. So I think that's an important point to make here too. It doesn't change the story, but I think that's out there. But it really is important to note that manipulation of this data has primarily been on the side of those who don't believe global warming is happening.
Regardless
And
of
what's-
where you stand on the science, the rubber hits the road when you look at the policy issues and how Congress is going to treat those next year. And the principles that they adhere to, the work that they do to ensure that electric rates, energy costs remain affordable, that in our case electric system reliability is preserved, that we're making the investments that we need to make in technology, and that any policies have appropriate time frames for adaptation. And beyond all that, with Copenhagen, we need to make sure that there's international participation and that that participation is meaningful.
And when you say that, do you mean all, what is it, 98 countries now that are going to be represented there next week? Everybody's signing the treaty? If
Well,
there
there's
is
192 countries that are going to be present.
Okay.
And there's 60 to 90 negotiators who are going to be trying to sort all this out.
And so it's important for competitiveness with the American economy. It's important here in Colorado that whatever happens in Copenhagen, whatever happens with policy decisions that are being looked at next year, particularly in the Senate, that everything that's done, keep in mind some key principles, those around affordability, reliability, investing in technology, and having the full participation of the global economy.
And there's one other piece that is often forgotten but is really rising in the conversation, and that is, you know, we had inconvenient truth, and now we have inconvenient youth. There is a youth movement across the world, literally, of young people who are coming into this debate, and they're asking to be heard, because whatever we do now and whatever we do next, they're the ones that are going to take the brunt of it, or the best of it, whatever it is. And there's a young man, I just want to share this really quickly, by the name of Alec Lures, who is 15 years old, who has been working on climate change since he was 13. He has given presentations to 20,000 people in 135 different venues. He's at the White House today. He's at the
My
White House
goodness.
today. And I've been working with him, and he is coming to Copenhagen, and there are youth all over the world, including China, Germany, Spain, you name it, from Africa, who are coming together at this conference to raise the voice of youth and say, please, whatever you do, consider the intergenerational impacts. Consider that. We have a voice, and we want to be heard.
When you talk about what might happen in Congress next year, given the enormity of everything else Congress will be dealing with next year, what influences do you see there? I mean, are these public opinion polls that show people being a little bit skeptical going to be a factor?
I think they'll be used. They'll certainly be used to make arguments on both sides. But I think the thing that is important to note is that there have been dips in public opinion in terms of support over time, and there have been increases in support over time. What has happened, I think, is that mostly we've stayed pretty consistent. Around 2/3 of the American public has said that global warming is real and climate change is real, and that we need to take some action to do something about it. So while there are kind of temporal dips in support or increases in support, overall it's been about 2/3 of the American public that supports taking action on this. And I think eventually the Congress will pass something that is pretty close to what the President has talked about, close to what we've seen passed in the House already, and what is before the Senate. Their goals are a little more aggressive. But I think it is a fair question to ask whether or not that's enough. whether that really is what we should be talking about and whether those targets are aggressive enough to meet the challenge that's before us.
There's another point of view that I've been reading about. Lester Brown, who founded the World Watch Institute, he says there's a juggernaut or momentum building toward doing something about climate change in this country, that 100 coal-fired power plants will not be built. They were proposed, but for many reasons, regulatory and public pressure, they're not going to get built. And that we are kind of already in the system of dealing with this issue. And Congress, you know, maybe is going to have to catch up, running after the people, I think, who get it. I think right now we're in the midst of a horrible economic downturn. We have the Tiger Woods story to consume us. I mean, you know, how much can Americans take in at one time? You know, we only have limited capacity here to be upset. So, but you know, if you buy Brown's approach, we're on our way to doing what we have to do. We're slow, but we're there. We're getting there.
You know, Senators Lieberman, Graham, and Kerry are going to be likely working with the key committee chairs in the Senate to produce new legislation that will take another attempt at addressing climate. Certainly the bill that was passed out of the Environment and Public Works Committee at the Senate earlier this year had significant costs, and we had significant concerns with that legislation, as we did with the Waxman-Markey legislation. What is a positive sign is that Senators Bennett and Udall, along with 12 other Democratic senators, signed on to a letter addressing some of the issues with how allocations would be apportioned in a cap-and-trade program. And that's been an important point for the electric cooperatives and really utilities and consumers across the West. And these are two senators who are in a position, obviously, to support climate change legislation, yet they signed on to this letter. It really is a sign that many in the Senate are looking at what the real challenges are with legislation and trying to figure out what is just the right approach and addressing some of the harder issues with some of the bills that have been passed either out of the Senate or out of the House or out of Senate committees.
Well, I think I think your two comments, Betsy, yours, and the last comment relate to one another in some ways, because I think it's a question. I think the fundamental question here is not what the numbers look like when a bill passes out. I think the question is the United States prepared for leadership on this issue, both in Copenhagen, but also in terms of our economy here? Are we ready to embrace a clean energy economy that is transformational in nature? Because I'll tell you, a lot of the other countries in the world are. South Korea is investing 2% of their GDP into clean energy technologies, into research and development of new products and new technologies that are going to help them to thrive in the economy. Germany is already the largest investor in solar energy, in solar photovoltaics. China is a huge manufacturer of these technologies as well. And I think the question is the U.S. going to move fast enough, and are we going to create our own vibrant and thriving clean energy industry, or are we going to let the rest of the world do it and then we have to buy those technologies from them? So I think that's an important point that we really, I think it comes to more than reductions, it's about leadership.
You know, that's interesting. I'm going to insert a quote here that caught my eye because, Sally, I'd love to talk more about what is already in progress and going on in the world. But this is the man named Rajendra Pachauri, who is the head of the UN's Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, saying in the near future that car use will have to be curbed, hotels and restaurants will stop serving ice water, guests will have their energy use monitored, heavy taxes will have to happen to discourage people from flying and force them onto the train. And last year he called for sharp cutbacks in meat consumption because of greenhouse emissions, of course. So where are these things headed? I mean,
Well,
if I go to a hotel someplace, am I going to not get ice water today?
Well, some hotels now, through the International Hotel Association, are not serving water unless you ask for it. They're not putting ice in the water unless you ask for it. The Restaurant Association has, in the United States, has just created a green initiative where restaurateurs are really looking and auditing their facilities to see what they can do, everything from recycling the grease for flex fuel vehicles to changing all of their light bulbs. I mean, everything from building green from the ground up. And if you already have a facility, how do you reduce, efficiency, we know, is the #1 area where we can go the fastest to reduce emissions. So that's where a lot of these efforts are going to take place first. But we are going to have to embrace some of these changes, and it's not about denial. Everybody thinks it's about, I'm going to be denied this, I'm going to be denied that, I have a lifestyle. It's about a choice. We want to choose that which doesn't impact on the next generation and which leaves a legacy better than what we've created at this point in time. So we have to take all of that into consideration. And also, I would say the other thing I wanted to mention about the naysayers, those in denial, and the confusion that has caused this oscillation of public sentiment or public concern about this, is that there's something called, and scientists know this, called the precautionary principle. If you have a question, if there is a doubt about something that is impacting, and in this case, the natural world, ecosystems, food scarcity, water resources, weather patterns, etc. If something's going on and you're not quite sure, taking the precautionary, conservative approach to address that is the way that we can protect ourselves from the worst of the worst.
Lee, tell us more about what utilities are doing in this area.
If we're going to successfully address greenhouse gas emissions, if we're going to be able to manage our emissions as a region, as a country, as a world, we're going to need to invest in technology. And utilities are making significant investments in new technology development that is really critical to be able to go forward and manage emissions and not have those sort of life-changing things that you just described. For Tri-State, for instance, we are participating in a number of carbon sequestration projects, as well as we just received DOE funding and are putting our own funds in to a major carbon sequestration assessment in northwest Colorado near our Craig Power Plant. This week we're also announcing an expanded agreement with the Electric Power Research Institute looking at integrating concentrated solar power with a coal-powered plant in New Mexico. So there are significant things that can be done with technology that help ensure affordability, ensure reliability. Addressing emissions from coal-based power plants is a big part of that. Coal is an important part of keeping electric rates affordable, keeping energy reliable. So we need to develop technologies that will continue to allow us to use coal in a responsible way.
Before we wrap this up, I'm sorry, Betsy, but I'm interested to know whether you think there will be an actual treaty out of Copenhagen, and are there lowered expectations for it? Anyone?
I don't think there will be. I think Mexico in 2010 is where a treaty will be signed. I think at Copenhagen there will be an architecture developed and perhaps some sort of binding agreement that will be taken into Mexico. But as far as a treaty being signed, no. And I think one of the reasons is that the United States, in particular, does not have, the President does not have legislation that has passed that he can take with him and say, this is what we're doing. He's saying this is what we want to do, but he can't say this is what we're doing.
I think the rest of the world has their doubts about our commitment. You know, we didn't participate in Kyoto, and the President has really come out in the past couple of weeks in particular to say we have a commitment. But I think people are worried about what the Congress is going to do. And so I think the rest of the world wants to see concrete commitment from the United States before they're willing to make commitments. I mean, the reality is the European Union has already done what we're proposing to do by 2020. So they've already reduced their emissions by that magnitude. So we know it's possible. It's just a question of, do we have the political will and do we have the ability to push something through the Congress? I think the world's waiting and watching us.
Last quick comment, Betsy?
I agree with everything they've said. Obama just has way too much on his plate, and I don't think the country is united yet. I think we need, I mean, scientists really have fallen down on the job of getting us all on board, and we're just not ready yet for Copenhagen.
We will leave it there for this week of Colorado's State of Mind. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have comments on tonight's discussion, we hope you'll share those with other viewers at our website, rmpbs.org. And now thank you very much to this week's guests for a great discussion, Sally Ranney and John Golden Dubois, Betsy Marston, and Lee Bowie. Thank you all for taking time to do this. And next week, we're going to be looking at the status of the home foreclosure crisis, as well as what a slowly recovering market is showing potential buyers. That's next Friday evening at 7:30. So glad you could join us on this Friday. I'm Cynthia Hessen. Good night.
Risks.
Well, I think we have to be particularly sensitive to low-income people in this argument, because I think we obviously don't want to push people into poverty because of cost of energy, but I don't think that's the real issue. I think the real issue is, are we going to embrace an economy of the future, or are we going to stay rooted in either the past or even where we are today?